Welcome to everyone who's joined so far. And here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Ask the Analyst session for the 2026 Fosway 9 Grid for Digital Learning. I'm John Kennard, Content Editor at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, and I will be your host for today's session. Founded in 1996, Fosway Group provides in-depth corporate research on next-gen HR talent and learning practices. We provide analyst and advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international headquartered multinationals and corporates, as well as independent vendor research and EMEA market commentary. We're going to talk about the corporate section in a little bit, but just to tell you about the report in brief, this year's report reveals a market experiencing its third consecutive year of economic stress. Flat budgets, greater scrutiny of the content supply chain are increasingly commonplace, coupled with AI changes that both expose and necessitate the need to change learning strategy for those in the vendor market yet to do so. I'm delighted to welcome to this call lead analyst on this research, Myles Runham, as well as Fosway's CEO and founder, David Wilson, to discuss and dissect all the findings in this latest iteration of the 2026 of the Fosway 9 Grid for Digital Learning. Apologies. A couple of housekeeping notes there. We will have a Q&A section at the end, so please think about some questions. Feel free to ask them as we go along. I'll gather them up and ask them in reverse chronological order. Do play nice. There's going to be some introductory content at the start from David to kind of set the scene, and then we'll move on to this year's 9 Grid. There will be a recording made available afterwards. And I think that's it. So without further ado, David, it's over to you.
Hi, and thanks everybody. Welcome from me too. Looking forward to hopefully an interesting conversation and some questions a bit later on from you. And I do, want to emphasize the point of these sessions is to give you a chance, not just obviously to hear Myles talk about this directly as the lead analyst for digital learning, but also to be able to ask questions as well. So that's the whole point of an Ask the Analyst session. Just a couple of slides from me really, which we do before every one of these, which is just to emphasize a little bit more context around where the 9 Grid comes from. We get a lot of questions around, what the methodology and process is, etc. So apologies if you've heard this before, but it is really important to keep emphasizing it. So the 9 Grid is each 9 Grid is a bit of a monster. We obviously run them for 5 different segments. It's an all year round process really, and typically it's built up over a number of years in terms of what we're doing. But then each year there is a completely full cycle, and actually the analysis that we do each year is zero-based. So we redo the analysis each year, looking at where everybody is, and that includes not just the briefing process, customer referencing and so on, but also things like the functional capture and analysis with the vendors, and now also looking at the AI research that we're doing as well. So this is it's a monster process, and obviously the 9 Grid report has a lot of information in it. I'll talk about that in a second, but also so it's much more than just the diagram at the end and even the trends kind of information we're looking at, but also obviously the insights and stuff that we have behind that, and plus all the data we have, which obviously, particularly from a corporate client perspective, gives us the opportunity to be able to be quite opinionated very quickly based on real deep knowledge and understanding and decision tools based on the vendor data. The inputs that go into this are very wide and varied, from our corporate research network and roundtables that we run, multiple kind of corporate inquiries and stuff that typically happen through the year, and any private advisory work we will do related to specific topics, and that happens in the background a lot. That's not really visible, but that's something, again, if you are a corporate client looking to make decisions around this, you should maybe think about how you can engage with us to get some input quickly as well. There's also a public research process. We run surveys, and then a lot of customer referencing information as well that comes off the back of the vendor cycles that we add in. There's a structured data capture, both looking at functional and non-functional information, and that's redone every year. And then we do independent briefings and demonstrations, etc., and so on, as you would expect. So there's lots and lots of sources of information, and we run a customer referencing cycle off the back of that as well. So there are lots of sources of the information that we're pulling together. the who gets included, who doesn't, is based on a couple of basic criteria. So first of all, who's in active use within our corporate research network? Obviously, there are hundreds of potential vendors for we could include. The 9 grids have all kind of had a bit of a inflation in terms of numbers in them. There's always pressure to add more vendors into, etc. But we have to filter that based on who we see as being relevant to that corporate buyer audience. So who's actively being used, who's actively in consideration. And then there are, of course, innovator companies which are, on the wider radar sometimes for the corporates, but ones that where we feel that they have the potential to achieve, like, that one of the above kind of criteria as well. This is not a pay-for-play environment. You can't buy your way onto a 9 grid. It's the decisions of inclusion are purely based on merit from and by the lead analyst. And you also can't decline to be included. So vendors can't buy their way off of it either. So it's completely objective in terms of who we're including. And as I said, filter towards the primary options we see vendors relevant to our target audience, which are typically EMEA headquartered private sector companies, multinationals, and sometimes obviously the EMEA end of global firms or firms that are global. So that's kind of who gets to go to be involved. I'd also emphasize that the list of vendors we actually involve in the research is significantly larger than the number that actually are included on the 9 grid. So we are constantly looking and tracking at many others, and then just as I said, making a decision about who goes in based on merit. The primary analysis view, so even though there's a very extensive vendor process, the primary analysis point of view is always based on what customer view is. And that's both about inclusion, but it's also ultimately around their positioning and their rating in here as well. And the vendors don't tend to be shy about their own ability, importance, and trajectory. But obviously, one of the things that we are constantly really looking at is the customer perspective on that. And you will notice if you've been tracking 9 grids for a long time, you can quite often have vendors which have quite a high presence in the market, but maybe have got struggled, for example, around their customer satisfaction, and so on. That can often dominate quite a lot in terms of the perspective that we end up having of somebody. The vendor input is still really important. We use it to cross-validate assumptions, maybe identify if there are acquisitions or new developments they've done, elements of the roadmap that we haven't necessarily seen earlier in the year. But it's a secondary process and it's used more for cross-validation and so on. But obviously the data we have from that is incredibly unique. I mean, nobody else has that, and it's very, very up to date. And that can be used to support, as I said, corporate clients trying to make an accelerated decision and so on, things like that. I'll touch on that in a second. The final end product that you see publicly is, of course, the 9 grid report, which is much more than the diagram, which obviously we're going to focus on, and Myles is going to talk us through. The trends sections particularly are really important to read because that gives you a view of not only how we are seeing the market, but ultimately that view of the market is influencing how we are rating the vendor performance as well, particularly when we're looking at the potential for them to increase their relevance or performance in the market going forward. And obviously, and I'm sure we'll talk at many points in the session today around things like AI and so on. There's a massive changes in terms of not just the capabilities that vendors are doing, but the way almost the supply chain sometimes around the way, and particularly in digital learning and the way content's being looked at and so on. So the trends are really important to read, both market and solution trends, to understand how we're kind of weighting the criteria around assessing vendors and so on. We also, and Myles will touch on this in a second, we're also looking at both kind of full capability providers, what we call suite providers. Obviously in digital learning, this is often content and services and platforms and everything. And specialists that play just in certain parts of the market or just in certain parts of the capability set as well. So I always recommend you download and read the reports rather than just look at the diagram. There's also a lot of information around the criteria that are behind that, actually understanding the 9 grid and what the different variables mean specifically in the digital learning context. The final comment from me really is, This is research. We know a lot of people read the research. We get thousands of companies that actually download the research and use it. But it's really just the start. As I've said, there's huge amount of data we have behind the scenes, and obviously we have a huge amount of very, very up-to-date insight around where vendors are going, the trajectory, their capabilities, what we feel is real and what is more marketing, if you like, related to capability. So if you are a company looking to make decisions around your existing supplier ecosystem or source new solutions or so on and things like this, we can provide a very, very up to date and often sometimes quite constructively critical view around that in terms of who best to involve and also what the capability differences are between vendors. That can be done through a kind of more formalized corporate contract and what we call accelerated buying. So you can do that to get a sense around vendor capability, who's the right ones to include in shortlist, or even maybe get some background support, air cover around an RFP process. So if you're running an RFP and want some input around the vendors or to interpret whether their responses to you feel real to us or not, then obviously that's a potential. But we also have a what we call the Fosway Corporate Network, so you can become individual member of that and get access to things like private analyst time, so maybe some time with Myles to discuss specific vendor options and so on. We also run a lot of corporate roundtables, including a face-to-face symposium event, which we're running. We're running one in May, for example, around AI and learning. So if you're part of that network, you can get access to some of those things. And depending on which level you're on, or as I said, you can engage with us to get input around specific decisions you're making on a more structured basis. And the comment at the bottom of the in red here is actually a real thing that came back based on some discussions that we had a few years ago, where it's quite common to find when you talk to companies that there's probably a 50-50 basis where people think they chose the right partner. But often what you find is even the 50% that chose the right partner have often executed suboptimally, if I can put it like that. They haven't implemented that well. That's not, 20, that's a 25% chance of success. So I think thinking about how you can maybe get input, or maybe, whether we can take a critical friend role here to help challenge the way you look at these decisions and also the specific vendor options that you have on the table. It's potentially a good way of increasing that percentage rate. So think about that. And obviously, if you're interested specifically, Jack is sat in the background on this call. We're happy to kind of pick up and have a conversation with you about that. So on that note, I'll now hand over to Myles to talk about the digital learning.
Thanks, David. Excuse me. And thanks everybody for joining us. So just a few notes around the functional model itself. And as David said, actually, I think in the case of digital learning, it's a sort of mix of functional and service capabilities that we use to analyze the vendors in the market. The first is probably most straightforward or most obvious: learning content, which is probably meaningfully learning content and learning experience. Increasingly, it's not just about the content, which tends to divide up into three categories: off the shelf products and services, custom and blended are really the three components that we bring together for that. So that's the full suite of capabilities, from responding to demand, creating design, through to kind of production, release and publish. Clearly, a large number of providers have some kind of platform capability, whether that's to manage and manage access to the content that they offer to the market and to customers, excuse me, or to in a more specialist capability, such as scenarios, simulations, etc. So that's really sort of the platform capabilities we try to describe here to make those content and services as valuable as possible and as scalable as possible. Digital learning transformation has become perhaps a slightly busier category, and we've added some capabilities here over the last couple of years to reflect the way the market's changing, particularly around consulting services. But this is a lot of here's focus on making the most of and changing the operating model to make the most of the opportunities from learning technologies and digital learning. tools and products. The managed learning service has changed again a little bit here. We've seen much more competition in the market, which we'll come to in a minute, around managed services, particularly for larger customers. So we've added some additional sort of sophistication to the model in this category. And the last is other capabilities, and it sounds like other is sort of damning with faint praise, but here really this is about the sort of QA and managing accessibility, consistency, reliability, etc. So these are sort of crucial, but don't necessarily gather into a different kind of headline category. So those are, and as Casson said, thank you. Yeah, that there is the opportunity to improve the spelling there. Thank you. There's two categories, as David referenced earlier. The fuller service suite providers, so that's fully offering a sort of full range of digital learning solutions, and that tends to include off-the-shelf prepackaged content and bespoke and custom content. Not just content, but I suppose it's bespoke and custom programs, perhaps more accurately, which can include a large range of modes, modalities, formats, and experiences. Increasingly, coaching tools and coaching capability is part of those services, and then managing through digital adoption, and as we've talked about, consulting and platform opportunities as well. So it's really the full, I guess, what we might call the full suite of digital learning capabilities described in that, and then clearly specialists are much more focused on one particular area. That might be a specialist library provider in terms of off the shelf, or a specialist in terms of the kind of solution. So that would include coaching specialists, immersive scenarios, simulations, etc. And increasingly then sort of AI capabilities like synthetic media and design as examples. So those are the two types of businesses, the types of vendors that we cover in this segment. And then before we open up to questions, it's an opportunity, I suppose, just to share and highlight some of the factors that we found throughout the analysis, and particularly highlighted some of these components in the research. So as John said at the opening, I mean, this is still an uncertain market. I think we've seen a few years now of economic challenge. So we've seen customers' budgets tighter. We've seen customers' budgets reducing, customer headcount in learning teams reducing. So there's a real pressure on the market, and that's been consistent for a while. I think there's a couple of things to add to that now. Uncertainty is playing out more than we'd seen in the past. Clearly, that's to do with the sort of geopolitical environment, economic conditions, increasingly then in more recent months, warfare, etc. And this is making customers less confident, and perhaps less confident to make longer term investment decisions as well, and to delay buying decisions. There's quite a lot of pressure to simplify supply chain arrangements, not just necessarily to save money, but to also simplify and reduce the effort in managing large, complex supply chains, particularly for larger international customers. At the same time as this, we're seeing AI really play out in terms of changing the content economics in the market. So it's now possible the connection between the ideas in the content and the content format, the content value and the content format have been slightly dismembered or disrupted. So previously, it was only possible to access the ideas and the value in content by purchasing the content format in terms of perhaps e-learning, or in terms of video or a document, a report. Whereas now, large language models are making those ideas in the content accessible without having to actually use the content format or purchase the content format. And that's really starting to change the market quite importantly now. From a learning experience point of view, it's huge potential for personalization, much more flexible kinds of solutions that are less dependent on content formats. So there's a huge amount of potential, and we're starting to see that play out in the market beyond the more immediate impacts of greater efficiency, speed, and lower cost in content production. But that's breaking of the relationship between the content, the value that's in the content, and the content format is really starting to change the dynamics of the market. We've seen quite a lot, if not, I'd say the vast majority of the vendors you can see here and others that we speak to throughout the research are really changing the strategies as a result. So either They're changing the way they go to market. They're adding products on top of content services, or they're actually trying to sort of completely change the proposition of the business. So the market's actually quite dynamic now because of those 2 points. AI development, and you'll see this in the digital learning market assessment that we're publishing for AI. That AI development has become very rapid in the last 12 months. I think in previous years, we'd seen it more of a story of potential and possibility with some more modest growth, and more modest investment. I think in the last 12 months, it's really accelerated, not just in terms of content capability and content development, but also in the kinds of solutions that can be offered: greater personalization, richer data, and better analytics are probably three of the main threads to that significant development. So really, those points are combining to really change the nature of the market now. We've also seen, I think there's always been demand for simulations and richer learning experiences beyond the sort of consumption and completion of content. I think one of the things that we've seen in the last 12 months, perhaps a little bit more, is that demand continues to grow. But one of the implications for the use of AI in the production of simulations and the use of populating simulations on specialist platforms is that the simulations can be richer and deeper and broader now because of the ability to apply content to those simulations to a much greater scale and a significantly lower cost as well. So that's making simulations more applicable to more customers as well. And I think that's particularly important in skills areas where the practice of skills, the opportunity to practice those skills in safety and gain feedback through AI tools, it is significantly driving demand as well. We've seen consulting services have been really important for the last few years, but in the last 18 months, particularly last year, we saw increasing demand for consulting mainly from the larger scale suite providers that you see on the grid here, where a lot of customers are coming to them to help manage the change that AI is inspiring in organizations, but also to be able to approach customers to target problem solving more accurately. So one of the threads behind this trend is the need for learning and development to be a more strategic partner, to offer greater kind of accuracy and proof of impact on significant business problems. Clearly, that requires a framing of those problems with accuracy and quantifying the problems accurately so that you can then monitor impact. So consulting approaches are becoming much more significant and much more in demand. There's demand, but I think it's relatively still immature. So there's only a few providers who probably do this really deeply, but it's clearly there's a significant trend that's changing the market there. And the last point is that we're starting to see a significant evolution of coaching because of the arrival of AI. I think it's been interesting to see, and be interesting to see this next week at Learning Technologies as well, the extent to which coaching is being offered as a new service add-on because of the ability of AI models to be applied to coaching conversations, perhaps, or to coaching kind of feedback that might be about their personal behavior. It might be personal effectiveness. It could be skills coaching, etc. I think we're going to see more of that. What's interesting is the extent to which this is being offered as a substitute for human coaching, or a new market segment in itself, or the ability to add coaching capability and efficacy to existing solutions. I think all of those things are happening at the moment, but what it's doing is making it much more confusing to understand what the value of coaching is then, who has the expertise and who can demonstrate that expertise as customers approach those new kinds of solutions. But it's a very dynamic part of the market, and we're expecting to see much more investment in this, whether it's actually called coaching or called something similar or adjacent. I think there's one other point probably to make about the grid that's not so obvious at first glance, perhaps, is that we've started to see, particularly in the last 12 months, quite a lot of mergers and acquisitions activity in the market. So probably the most obvious candidates here in terms of standout deals as the combination of MindTools and Kineo. So you can see in the strategic leader zone on the top right, MindTools, Kineo combined. There were previously individual vendors on the grid. I guess the biggest in terms of scale is the anticipated closure of the deal between Coursera and Udemy, which is going through the later stages of regulatory approval in the US in the next few months. And I think that deal is probably the one that signals the change in the content markets most clearly. There's also towards the left there the potential leader Liberate, which used to be called EI Design. That's a combination of EI and Liberate from Australia. Skillwell as a combination of ETU and Realize It. So again, another joining of two of the businesses that were on the grid separately before that. And then NIIT, excuse me, NIIT acquired SweetRush earlier in the year, the sort of specialist learning design capability in the US, and Learning Pool. In fact, Learning Pool, I think, closed an acquisition in the last few days. I've just got back from holiday, but I think they closed a deal for a frontline employee services in remote work in the last couple of days, and also they bought the Elucidat authoring tool. I think that was probably a few months back as well. So there's a lot of deals in place in the market, and there's a lot of anticipation. I think not just from ourselves that there'll be more of that kind of merger and acquisition activity as vendors seek growth, seek access to new markets and new capabilities, but also sort of capitalize on sort of the dynamic nature of the market at the moment. So those are, so a quick tour of some of the headline findings that sort of sit behind the grid and deeper into the report. David, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add before we dive into the questions, observation overall.
Just one comment then. Maybe I was going to ask you if you would reflect on any of the other kind of vendor changes and stuff. But I mean, the only comment I'd make is the combination of these first 3 points is that, as well as the M&A activity increasing, what we've also seen is a significant increase in the number of vendors who are seeking to redefine their position in the market effectively and transition into being something more than just a content provider, for example, or a bespoke service provider. So I think the combination of those, that sort of economic impact, together with things like AI changing supply chain, some of the supply chain dynamics around it, means that there's a lot of vendors that have, well, especially some of the smaller ones actually, that have kind of struggled a little bit more in the market. Somebody that's single digit growth now is often quite good compared with the general market, whereas before it would have probably been lagging growth. But also, just frankly, sort of repositioning themselves and trying to reinvent what their story is, or transitioning from being maybe content-led to more of a platform-led story and so on. And that's kind of really evident in all sorts of places. Skillsoft now talking about itself as a skills management platform rather than necessarily as, historically been seen as more of a digital learning library, obviously one of the biggest leaders in that space historically and so on as well. So I think that's also amplifying some of the changes that you've talked about, Myles. Any kind of observation around any other vendor trajectory changes or any big movers in there that you want to make before we kind of go into questions?
I guess I suppose we'd seen you've sort of got that row of three along the top line of the strategic leader, and there was sort of three managed service providers. And I know there's a question here about sort of AI capabilities and agentic capabilities. I think one of the things that we saw interestingly from all three providers, GP, InfoPro, and NIIT, was a sort of significant acceleration in their use of AI for kind of creating sort of management intelligence for their customers. So that's about the sort of the optimization of those arrangements, but also sort of the increased capability and scale to turn around some much more powerful solutions more quickly. I think that's been a significant driver in terms of investment. I think there's a general point, I suppose, about that the uncertain market and the continuously difficult trading conditions is a genuine trend to the left. I guess the market's not growing rapidly at all. I think previously, I guess we'd seen in times of economic hardship, digital learning tended to grow anyway, as investment was switched from classroom activity to digital to sort of scale more cheaply, I guess, crudely put. That relationship, I think, feels like it's broken now. So that the market is no longer benefiting from that switch of spending and switch of investment. So we're sort of seeing the market kind of growing much more under its own steam, and particularly in the last 12 months, probably not really growing under its own steam. So, and that's one of the factors I think that's been important sort of, I suppose, fuel to those changes you were mentioning, David, is that the sort of it's not a market of guaranteed growth anymore. So businesses are having to really focus much more on those changes to find that growth. So I think we've seen some sort of significantly, stronger growth perhaps from smaller providers, Skillable, specialist in excuse me, skills validation. They've really sort of supercharged their growth in terms of that capability, which is a growing significance as well. And I suppose we'd seen some other providers who'd managed to capitalize on that sort of consulting and very focused business solution service. Perhaps Sponge is an example of that, along with an IIT as well, which I think has been an interesting. I suppose it's sort of specialism that's probably harder to detect in the diagram itself to sort of continue with that growth. As a few to highlight, I could talk at length about all of them, but I'll wait for the questions.
Thanks, Myles.
The thing I was just going to say quickly, because it's kind of relevant, is I believe that the AI market assessment for digital learning for 2026 published today. So that should be available if anybody wants to go and look at it. And obviously, just picking up the question around AI and agentic is, so one of the things that we made as a change to the model this year is we basically, I think it was this year or whether it was last year, we went away from AI being a section effectively to AI being embedded wherever it's relevant across all of the whole functional model. So there is a very extensive, and there's actually a separate parallel process that we're running looking at AI specifically for part one, looks at vendor roadmap and capability, which has just been published. Learning systems was published about a month ago, something like that. And part two of that process is then looking at AI adoption and value, but the AI model is embedded across all of the whole thing. So there isn't a separate AI sections to answer that one question as well. So, but I think it was launched today. So if you want to, we'll probably put a link. We can put a link to that. Jack, if you can put that on the thanks on here, if anybody wants to specifically go and look at the AI analysis that we've done specifically, which is a separate process. It runs in parallel. We're running part of that in parallel to the 9-grid process, but it's not separate. It just has a bunch of separate deliverables to it as well. But obviously, we're also looking at that as part of, as I said, the trajectory tracking for individual vendors and so on as well. John, yeah, I'll pass back to you and maybe we can move on to questions.
Sure thing. Thanks both. So yeah, the questions have been coming in. There's quite a long one, which we will get to, but we'll do fastest fingers first. So Tamsin asked about, given the prominence of LLMs as the entry point for learning, do you foresee tokenization becoming a more frequent commercial model for content vendors rather than enterprise-wide licenses? Maybe talk a bit about tokenization, if that's helpful to.
I will. I'll do that, and I'll assume, Tamsin, that I've interpreted the question properly as well. But let me know if I'm answering or barking up the wrong tree. So I think this refers to the point that I was trying to make about sort of this disruption of the economic value of content being associated with the content format. That the large language models, obviously the conversational interface into them, means that accessing the tokens that express the ideas in the content is where the real value lies now. You don't have to watch the video, read the reports, or sort of download the podcast to access those ideas now. One of the interesting challenges to that is that publishers had previously had the economic model of selling bundles of content or packaged content. So you buy the book, you buy the 20 SCORM objects in the library, etc., and that's how the economic equation works. If you no longer need to acquire content in that manner, in that sort of bundled or formats, then how do you make money from this transaction? As if you were a publisher or you want to be a content creator. Is it the question? I think then the tokenization means is the value of the ideas sort of bought in tokens rather than in content objects, as it were, or content packages. And I think my view, Tams, is I don't think we know yet. I think at the moment there isn't really a model of exchange in that way. So I think and I don't think content creators are looking at it in that way yet. I think one of the things we're seeing, though, as a potential sort of signal of this sort of tension emerging and maybe resolving is for those larger library providers who would have a network of content creators within their library, they have started to unbundle the ideas and the expertise in those courses to make them available in sort of shorter nuggets or as part of conversation experiences. But it's not yet clear how those course creators feel about and can make a decent business out of having their content unbundled or their ideas unbundled in that way. So I think it's an open question at the moment, but it's definitely very disruptive. One of the things that may happen is that, as we saw with the sort of creator economy on YouTube, is that lots of traditional providers looked at YouTube content creators as some sort of, the amateur upstarts, but they've now become the standard by which the rest of the industry has sort of been led. So, perhaps something like that will happen as well. But I think it's too early to tell. But I think this point is really the most significant disruption in the market from AI, in my opinion. But we'll keep a close eye on it from here. I hope that was the right interpretation of tokenization.
We also put specifically one of the trend comments which talked about that a little bit, both in terms of as you referred to, like the separation of the value of content from its format and the deconstruction almost of it, talking about that as a sort of emerging trend, but then obviously the economic side of that as well, which is who gets paid for what. And I think the sort of site-wide license the whole library model, which has kind of dominated history effectively in terms of the digital learning content libraries, is definitely something that is not just increasingly under threat. I think that's been true for a long time, but is it increasingly not viable? And I think obviously as AI kind of deconstructs and accesses to sort of use what it wants to, it's really, really important for the vendors to actually work out how they construct a viable economic model around it, right? Because otherwise they don't have a business. And this is one of the reasons why we're also seeing, I think, many of the content companies now really starting to position themselves almost as platform companies as well, so they can almost control the disintermediation or the deconstruction of their own content effectively, and actually make almost a platform revenue off of the process as well, or somehow, and things like this. So I think it's going to be really an interesting piece. We also see this in other market segments as well. When you look at some of the other things which are more process driven, more systems driven, less content driven, that some of those kind of behaviors, and then what becomes expected as freebie, what becomes effectively tokenized and paid for, what is seen as premium rather than standard, and all this kind of stuff is a really a moving target. And not many are making bold statements about it at the moment, because I think they're still trying to work out what the business model is. So, absolutely, we'll continue to track that.
Thank you, David. Patricia also says thank you. I think there's a bit more to her question, but we'll move on to someone else and maybe come back to it if we've got time. A rather long question from Sergio, but I'm giving it a go. I have a convoluted reasoning doubt. As far as I know, some content providers are offering MCP. Maybe also, Myles, you could explain Model Context Protocol for people as well. Just off the cuff there. With their content through a context window, for example, Coursera through ChatGPT. Some others are still commercializing their scorn based off the shelf catalogs and giving the option to vectorize the courses in the customer's LMS platform. I think he's asking, can you comment or elaborate on these two different ways of doing things?
I can try. I've just been catching up with Sergio's question. Thank you for the thought and the detail, Sergio. Well, let's have a go, and maybe also do follow up, because it might be that there's a misinterpretation in the detail here. I guess in terms of which model is going to succeed or which will be best, I don't think we really know yet. I think these are all useful and sensible experiments in the market to try and work out what customers are ready for, and I think that's a really important context here as well. What customers are ready for, what learners understand, and make sense, can make sense of, and then how do you sort of cohere a commercial model around that? So MCP, the Model Context Protocol, which I guess, is this sort of a tool or a means of accessing or making services accessible through whichever large language model or AI capability the customer wants to bring to bear. So it's kind of an opening up a kind of agent-to-agent interface, as you suggested. I think that there's a lot of potential in that. The extent to which that then sort of pushes the content, the sort of the content creators, sort of further back down the economic pile, I think is a really interesting risk. And if there is a need to try and package new ideas and what we would have previously called new content into solutions, then it's not clear, what the incentive is there as a content provider. I think you then, in the second option, let's hope that I understood the first option correctly. In the second option, this is more about using AI as a means of kind of unbundling the SCORM-based catalog and allowing customers on their own on their own platform to capitalize on the content within and to handle that more flexibly themselves. And as you suggested, exactly how the payment model works for that is again still being established at the moment. So I don't think there is necessarily an answer to any of these. I think what we'll need to see happen is a clearer sense of which problems customers are trying to solve from this. Is it a more powerful and accurate way of creating a kind of more personalized experience from the content library, from the off-the-shelf offer, or is it something that's more kind of much more dynamic than that through direct access through other tools? I think, and that's sort of probably part of the answer to that is how important the L&D function and their tools are in the end experience for the employees as well, and where the employees expect to find the answers to their questions and where their learning experiences lie. It's not yet clear that kind of dynamic approach for people to become active, self-discovering learners is sort of a behavioral norm yet. So I think what I'm saying is, well, I guess we're waiting to try and see at the moment, Sergio, if that makes sense of your question. I don't know, David, if you have another interpretation. I got a thumbs up from Sergio, so I'm going to take that as a win.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing is, I think we have to separate between what is almost an architectural discussion around how do we connect the dots between these different systems, between LLM and content and so on, and then also the practical use cases, right, that we then apply over the top. Because sometimes I think we can become a bit besotted. I definitely think digital learning industry has become very besotted by the interface mechanism, including SCORM, for example, and AICC, if you're old enough to remember that stuff, and things like this, and Tin Can and X/XAPI and so on. It gets very kind of focused on the mechanism, partly because often the mechanism didn't work very well and became a disabler for a lot of these things, rather than necessarily understanding what the use case is. And I think the interesting kind of point around here is again, going back to that deconstruction of content, right, which is the ability to be able to get access to relevant learning in whatever form it needs, disconnected from original format in the context of whatever the flow of the process is, right? So that means now not just doing a fixed click and turn e-learning course, but obviously being able to get access to the same knowledge insight and even some of the same things through more of a chat conversation. But it also means that we're moving towards a much more blended experience. Learning experience is not it's more of a much more intimate set of blends. In fact, things that are properly blended rather than just bolt on from one, a virtual classroom into an e-learning into a face-to-face, right, as literally a bolt-on series of things. And I think the more that we deconstruct things, then the more that becomes, especially now with coaching and AI and everything else in the mix, becomes there. But these content assets have a potential to service all parts of that model or no part of that model. And that's where also the challenge becomes about what do you get paid to do? If somebody, you're giving somebody the full capability set to do any of those things, but they're paying you for that on a reasonable consumption model or a reasonable number, how many licenses they've got access to, then that potentially works for you. But it doesn't if you're then being, as you say, some of this is happening without any control for your side, and you're not getting paid. So at the end of the day, you need both sides of that model to work, or there's no value in being a content creator, right? But I think then you've got the architectural, how does this get done, versus the use case in terms of what are we actually trying to do. And I think sometimes this is the danger that like lots of people fixing on MCP, and quite rightly so. We talk about that I think in the report, we also talk about it in the learning systems report as it being really important architectural bridge. But it is a technical capability. It's not necessarily the use case, right? It's what use cases do you run on top of it. So I think this stuff is still evolving quite quickly, but it's also going back to the comments we made before. One of the reasons why a vendor that saw themselves in one kind of fixed box is really struggling to sit there and almost needs to become, a platform provider as well as a source of content, for example, and then how do they monetize that model effectively? So this obviously, if you're a corporate buyer here, right, or if you're the things that you're trying to work out how you put this jigsaw together, and at the same time work out what role the different providers you already have or the new ones you want to fit into it, right, as well. So this is quite it's not to say it's difficult to know what the outcome is. We can see the directions of travel, but not necessarily what the dominant model that wins. And that's, I think, but definitely MCP, I think, is going to be a key piece of this story somehow.
I think as well, David, I wonder as well, I think that we sort of tend to fixate on, I'm not trying to generalize of our audience here as fixating on this, but I think the market tends to fixate on the use of generative AI tools and the capabilities to substitute the answering a specific question through learning content. I have a particular need, maybe a particular skill, particular piece of knowledge, or an update, and it's much more a transactional experience. I think there's still clearly a lot of demand for structured development experiences, maybe over a period of time to develop new skills. You're new to a role, etc., and just having a conversational experience, no matter how intelligent and agentic, it is not going to fill that. You need something structured, tailored, and with clear kind of scaffolding. I think the other thing that we highlighted in the report, but perhaps we haven't referenced here, is that the AI is tending to, or there's a clear tendency for the application of AI in digital learning and probably in learning systems as well to sort of supercharge the self-study model. So it's me learning with my device and my, but highly intelligent experience on my own. That shared experience and management of those shared experiences is really massively underdeveloped and underinvested, and AI isn't really being largely applied to that yet. Whether it ever will. So that whole sort of capability, perhaps strategic capability to help organizations change through the management of shared experiences over time, I think is a big gap that we're not really seeing AI address much, if at all, at the moment.
Thanks, Myles. Patricia, I have seen your other question. It's about agents. We've talked about them a little bit, but I am just going to come on to Menachem's actually, to vary things. And this is a more general question, actually, David. Menachem says, we were listed as content only, but we also have an LMS. We'd like to be listed as a suite. Do we need to apply for Learning Systems 9-Grid for it? Should we showcase that as part of our presentation next time? I guess this is a question about the process of analysis.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the way in which we've assessed, so we've put you in as a specialist. So we're talking about VinciWorks, I think, here. But the reality is, I mean, obviously that's an assessment based about what we think is the most, the lead part of the proposition for any vendor. I mean, obviously that's something that we can discuss with you afterwards, or Myles, can you pick that up with Myles as a separate conversation? The comment I would make is every content vendor has an LMS. Almost none of them don't, purely because they buy, and most of the bespoke vendors also typically have had an LMS of some capability as well, partly because in the past, if a customer didn't have an LMS, they'd no way of deploying content. So nearly everybody has some capability. That doesn't make it necessarily strategically important to their business or to why customers buy from them. So the criteria for consideration or being a suite, for example, within here is it's clearly seen as a key part of your offering, that total capability. That's a digital learning issue. I think it's only, I would only really think about the learning systems process as really somebody who's very much platform led in terms of what they do. But by definition, now most of those platform vendors also have content offerings, right? So it's become, and that was one of the comments I think in the report, we're blurring the boundaries between the segments because of, as I said, vendors needing to reposition themselves slightly to future-proof their story. And in most cases, that's tended to involve system vendors, platform vendors adding content library assets and even sometimes using AI to build their own libraries very quickly and offering those. But obviously in the digital learning side, it's tended to actually increase the importance of platform within the proposition for most of the vendors. That I think the concern is if they don't own at least or control at least part of that platform engagement, that they're there to be kind of ripped apart a little bit in terms of their content, their IP licensing model and stuff like that. So I think yeah, but obviously that's a specific use case. We can pick that up with you offline, as part of the kind of follow-on process.
Myles, anything to add?
No, I think no, that feels it's always, as David said, it's always sort of an ongoing monitoring as well from our point of view to make sure that we're reflecting the sort of the core capabilities and also where businesses are going.
I also think the other comment is it reflects the fact that we rate people based on how we see them, not necessarily how they talk about themselves. Because most of the vendors will often talk to themselves about full capability and everything. But in reality, if we know that from the inputs that we've got, that customers tend to not see them like that or not to engage with them like that, then obviously we'll take a view around that. So we're trying to reflect what we think is an objective view in the market rather than necessarily just vendor marketing positioning as well. So, but that's not a comment on this specific case. It's just in general, that's how we look at them.
Okay, a couple of minutes left, probably time for one more question. I am going to come back to Patricia, actually. You've kind of mentioned it already, but she said, we did not see the presence or development of AI agents. Do you think this will be a new category in the capability model, which we won't see in 2025, but definitely in 2026? Myles, how quickly will it develop?
I guess develop very quickly, and it is. I don't think we'll necessarily see it as a category in the capability model. I think, as David mentioned earlier, what we'll tend to see, what we've seen with AI capabilities, is they're applied to existing components of the capability model, and we're adding to them all the time, and particularly, as David said, through the AI research, where we're which helps us understand where the real demand and growth and capability is. I suppose between the completion of the 9 grid and the release of the report, there was a huge rush of capability and a large acceleration, through the use of harnesses and open claw and co-work, etc., Claude co-work. So, and we know that a number of vendors are applying those kinds of tools and capabilities to their solutions, and also to sort of adding additional value as well. So that's growing very quickly, and it's probably the headline of excitement around the current sort of growth in generative AI at the moment. So I think we will see that's changing very quickly, and so it will grow. Whether that becomes a particular capability on its own is less clear. I think it will then apply to existing capabilities. That's probably what we're seeing at the moment. But obviously that could change between now and this time next year. But it is definitely growing. I mean, I think it's one of the things, it's sort of an obvious point to say about the uptake of AI is it's growing extremely rapidly, not evenly, but rapidly.
David, any final thoughts before I move to closing slides?
No, that's fine.
No. Okay, well, on your screen there is a few links. The Digital Learning 9 grid, which obviously was out very recently. Our 2026 Digital Learning Realities research is out. Please do fill that in. Benchmark your progress against your peers. All other research is in the Fosway Knowledge Centre. This is where our infographics, our insights, our viewpoint papers, everything is kind of gathered up for you to peruse. And just before we completely wrap up, David, any word on the strategic AI project, which is now in its second year?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I think we published today the digital learning AI market assessment. So that's basically us looking at the vendor capability side of the story and tracking that. It's changed amazingly, quickly over the last 12 months. I think Jack put a link into the chat before to access that. If so, I would certainly suggest to people they look. But I think there's a second part to that process as well, which is looking at the question which we always get asked as well is not just around what the buyer trend is, but like who's really adopting and who's getting value from what. So there's a part two of that process, which is looking at adoption and value specifically. That's running on every segment, so in learning systems, digital learning, and also in our talent and HR areas as well. So there's an opportunity. One of the things we're looking for is corporates who are wanting to get involved in that project more deeply. There will be some more public survey stuff and things you see specifically around it, but actually there's also an opportunity to become a core participant, which means getting closer to the inside of the project, maybe getting some of your specific questions answered within that process. And we'd certainly recommend, if anybody is interested in doing that, to contact Jack, whose email is here, or follow up, on their website, etc., and so on. Also, we will be at Learning Technologies next week. So if anybody's there and wants to discuss that, but certainly from a corporate point of view, how do you get on the inside of this story and understand not just obviously where the capability sets are, but what is real and isn't. And then also ultimately what works and what doesn't. So the only other comment I was going to make is we've actually got a corporate roundtable, what we're calling a Fosway Symposium event, which is a face-to-face roundtable. It's corporate only attendance, and that will be running on the 12th of May. So if you're also interested potentially and from a suitable organisation, then please if you email Jack, again, he's jack.smith@fosway.com. We've still got a few places available on that, so we'll be doing it. Or as I said, if you're at Learning Technologies next week, come to the Fosway stand, which is C80, I think, from memory, the Fosway Analyst Lounge. We can talk to you a bit more about both AI project and potentially also the corporate roundtables that we're on the symposium event as well. So thanks very much for that, and hope you enjoyed the session from me.
Yes, thank you for everyone for attending, and to David and Myles for your insights as well. We will see you on the next one, which will be talent acquisition in June sometime. But like you said before then, we've got the small matter of learning technologies. So anyone visiting that, we'll see you then.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.